Hello everyone, I am Archibald Gordon and welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Goals. Now this is a conversation about what you and I can do to help make Jamaica the place of choice to live, work, raise families and do business by achieving 17 big goals. We're talking about the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs for short. Now, countries around the world have agreed to work on the SDGs to make the world a better place by 2030. And the idea is to make sure that everyone, everywhere can live a good life without harming the planet. And that without harming the planet part is really important because that's the sustainable part of sustainable development. Without the planet, we don't have a home, which brings us squarely to the goal that we're about to talk about today. It's a real threat to whether we will have a home. And that's goal 13, taking urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. Now, Jamaica's government, like countries all around the world, have agreed to act. But this is a national goal, which means that the government alone cannot get it done. We are the ones who live in our houses and we're the ones who live in our communities. So we all have to act. So let's talk about goal 13, why it's a problem for everyone if we do not achieve it, and what each of us can do in our homes, in our communities and workplaces to get the goal. Now, to break it down today, my guest is Claire Bernard. She is Deputy Director General at the Planning Institute of Jamaica, PIOJ, focusing on sustainable development and social planning. Her expertise as a development specialist is really about being good and great really at planning ways to improve society and the environment. She works in environmental management and climate change, plans and essentially manages projects to protect the environment and tackle climate change issues. And her current role right now, she's in charge of a division within the PIOJ that provides policy direction on matters of environmental management and planning. Welcome to Let's Talk Goals.
Good morning, thank you.
And I'd like to start by just distinguishing when we talk about climate change as to what we mean by weather and climate, the simplest terms.
Okay, the simplest way. Weather is really the atmospheric conditions relating to, so you can get things like rainfall, wind, temperature. Climate change, on the other hand, is a more long-term phenomenon. So you're talking about average daily temperature, rainfall, etc., over a longer period of time, much longer period of time, in a specific location. And of course, the length of time we're talking about, usually we look at 30-year horizons.
So you're looking at what happens over a longer period of time.
Longer time, right, in a given location, whereas weather talks about the atmospheric conditions on a shorter term basis.
So when we're talking about climate change, then we're talking about sort of longer patterns of change.
Patterns of change.
That people can see in a particular location.
Yes.
And some of those would include, for instance, the fact that over time we might see hotter summers, for instance.
We will. We may see change in rainfall patterns and so on. You have other things like sea level rise and all of those issues.
Let's talk about them one at a time.
Sure.
First, hotter summers. This could mean that more places could lead to needing more places, for instance, to cool off. What are some of the challenges that individuals would have with hotter summers?
Well, there are several issues for the individual with hotter summers. You can start at it from the health perspective. So with hotter summers, we're talking about how does the body respond to this extra heat. And we've been seeing some of that. We've been hearing people crying about how hot it is and all of that. There's the issue about, and this is related not just to the heat, but also to the rainfall. So you've been hearing people talking about not having water. Then the issue of the plants and or agriculture and how that's impacts production and so on. So from a personal perspective, you have health, you have food production, food security, and you have just the way you go about your daily work. For example, if you're a construction worker, how long can you be outdoors working in this extra heat? You know, those are implications for your health.
No, if you're talking, that's a personal perspective, but sort of personal as well as from a workplace perspective, hotter summers also has an impact on energy.
Oh, definitely. So you're talking about increasing your energy consumption because you're wanting to be cooling your environment. Now, that in itself has a twofold impact because the increasing cooling will have increasing cost in terms of use of energy. And that itself has an implication for the release of additional greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So it's almost a double-edged sword. So that's something that we have to think about as well.
When we talk about hotter summers, you could kind of put it in the same category as weird weather, but we are slightly different. We talk about weird weather, meaning that some places that would have traditionally been hot, they might be cooler, and some places which are cooler might be hotter, or that they be just, the weather is not operating the way it normally would.
Right, so you really are talking about different patterns across different places, which is why I made the point about location. So if you think of our context, it's unlikely that you'll have these variations in cool and hot. But the point is that our projections are that we will have more hot days, more hot nights, and so there are implications for us. There are also implications for our tourism industry, because if it gets that hot, the kind of attractiveness that we have as a destination might be lost, because the tourists don't want to come here to be fanning all the time. They want to be enjoying a warm enough climate, but that one that is also salubrious. So we have to think of that as well.
And also impacts as well in terms of farming as well, in terms of our ability to be able to plan.
Oh yes, so that's one of the issues relating to climate change. There's a bit of unpredictability about it. So we have our traditional seasons. We usually know when we're going to, or when we are to expect rain. With climate change, that kind of predictability goes out the door, so to speak. And so I think I heard someone say that last year we only had 8% of the rainfall for the month of February.
Yes.
Now, that's a tremendous shift. When you're thinking about your traditional rainfall periods, we are seeing decline in rainfall, and yet we are also having unseasonal rains at other times. So again, this unpredictability is part of what is impacting the society with climate change.
I want to talk about one more impact as well in relation to weird weather. And this has to do, for instance, so weird weather might mean, for instance, that it might rain a lot when it usually wouldn't, or the opposite as we've been talking about. If it rains a lot and you have heavy rains in particular time or particular period, also an impact on our infrastructure.
Okay, so for us, that has been one of our major challenges. At the Planning Institute of Jamaica, since about 2000, I don't know if you recall, you might be too young for this, but we had some very heavy rains in June 2000. And we have been tracking the impact of that kind of rainfall on the society since then. And we have found that since 2000 and now, or certainly the latter part of the 2000s, we have had much, much more severe episodes of severe rainfall. And that has had a tremendous impact on our infrastructure, to the point where we are in the process now of developing tools to bring more climate-related information in the planning of the country's infrastructure. And when our experience also is that when we look at the impact of damage and losses, certainly with respect to, say, some of these severe rainfall events, storms, etc., we have found that our infrastructure has been the most impacted sector.
Wow, so a lot of flooding, for instance, damage to roads and houses.
A lot of flooding, a lot of damage to roadways. We've been spending millions in terms of clearing landslides and related impacts. So yes, the infrastructure impact has been significant.
I want to talk about one more impact now in terms of like health issues. The expectation, people often think of, you know, climate change as just affecting, you know, whether we're hot or cold or it floods, but they're also talking about health issues. For instance, the fact that with hotter temperatures, particular kinds of bugs might be moving into your area because, you know, their habitats have changed. There could be more sort of health risks, new allergies or new illnesses, for instance. Why would this affect the individual and then the country?
Well, man is the center of the environment, so if the environment is impacted, certainly the individual is going to be impacted. Yes, the plants and the rest of nature would be impacted as well. But when you're talking about changes in habitat, we have noticed, for example, and again going a little backward, I don't know if you recall the incidents with Zika, chikungunya, those kinds of things. So we're finding that with these changes in rainfall patterns associated with climate change, we're also having changes in the incidence of vector-borne diseases. Again, it's the individual who's
and by vector-borne diseases, you mean diseases that are spread by
vectors like mosquitoes and so on. And it's the individual who ultimately is impacted by that. Of course, it has a broader national impact because it means that the health sector has to be spending more to respond to these incidents and to be spending more to treat the individual. And so we're using resources that could be spent for other things, education, and so on. Because
we don't have infinite resources, so we have to be making particular kinds of choices.
We do not.
You know, that point that you made earlier about the Zika, etc., people might have forgotten that. We had a whole series of them.
We did.
Zika, chikungunya,
right.
West Nile disease, I think at that point people were talking about. Didn't affect us, but was spreading around the place as well.
Yes.
And then we have also the impact in terms of on, you know, changes in nature, meaning losing particular kinds of plants and whether plants or animals and whether they will be actually able to survive these changes in climate changes as a consequence of climate change.
Right, and as before we talk about the changes in nature itself, just to talk a little bit about some of the things that we've begun to observe too. People with sinusitis, people with asthma, we've been noticing, and we're doing the research now to be able to validate whether this is true, that there has been an increasing in the incidence of those kinds of episodes, you know. So it's an important thing, you know, the heat, the dust, and all of those issues, the impact on persons with upper respiratory tract infections and so, or diseases, and so we have to check them. And yes, so changes in rainfall pattern, changes in temperature, etc., will impact the broader environment, and it will have deleterious impacts on some habitats. And so we are likely to be losing some of our birds, some of our insects and so on. Again, some of our trees, I know that the Ministry of Agriculture has established a seed bank as a response mechanism. So it is trying to preserve seeds of some species of plants that are not doing so well now. I know that some work has also been done in looking at crop suitability because of the changes in temperature, changes in rainfall. So we have to be looking at what are the crops that are more resilient to these kinds of changes. And I know that some work is being done by the agriculture sector as well in terms of how some of the livestock are responding. We know about poultry, for example, and the adaptive measure that some people are taking they're putting in like ventilated chicken houses because the hens are dying. They're not producing as many eggs because of the change in temperature.
If you've ever grown, for instance, what you call in farming circles layer chickens, which are the ones which have the eggs, etc., those are really delicate. They die very easy from things like heat, etc.
Yes.
But when you're also talking about plants, we're not just also talking about sort of rare plants, but also common ones as well, and how those are affected by climate change.
Yes, because again, they need the water. And with the changes, we're seeing some changes in precipitation, and so they're not getting the kind of water that they need to survive, and you see them dying along the way. So from a planning perspective, we have to be taking some of those things into consideration and to be coming up with projects to be responsive, not only at the sector level, but also to work with people at the community level. And we had a project recently which provided resources to individuals at the community level to be doing some local adaptation, you know, putting in contouring so that when the heavy rainfall comes, it doesn't wash away all the soil, so that they're able to plant their crops and preserve the yield of the soil.
I want to go into that question of adaptation in greater detail in a moment, but just so we complete this section of talking about the impacts. We talked about heat as one of the things that we have seen. In terms of also our bigger studies and what we're seeing, also storms getting stronger, for instance, links to disasters.
Right.
How are they linked?
Okay, well, I can't give you the scientific explanation of all of that. What I can tell you is that, again, from experience, as I said earlier, that we started to track the impact since 2000 with those unseasonal rains and all of that. And we have seen that there are instances in a given year where the number of major storm events are much more than a previous year.
So you used to have 2 storms, you might not be having 6 or 7 in a hurricane season.
There was one year, I think it might have been 07, when we had
Emily, Sandy, it's a whole series.
No, not Sandy. Sandy was later. When we had Emily and Wilma at the end of that year, but we had about 5 storms that year. It was really a devastation, because what you had was a compounding effect on the disaster. So you had the banana industry, for example, being almost wiped out because of the impact. And we're seeing that in a number of areas where the frequency of these events coming as fast as they are having a compounding negative effect.
This is particularly true when you talk about particular at-risk areas, for instance. So coasts or water resources, places where people live, you say farmed, tourist spots, health and forests are all vulnerable to climate change as well.
Yes, some areas are obviously more vulnerable, dependent on the particular climate risk that we're talking about. So if we're talking about coastal, the impact of sea level rise, then the persons living closer to the coastline are more at risk. And you would know that well over 60% of the Jamaican population live within what is called the coastal zone, hence the high level of vulnerability. And then you have people who are living in environmentally sensitive areas, so you're talking about the riverbanks and those kinds of things. And for them, the exposure is higher and the level of vulnerability increases. But then you also have the farmers who are dependent on, particularly rain-fed agriculture, so there is a vulnerability to them and their economy. And then you have the fishers, and you know, with the changes in the climatic condition, the sea surface temperature getting warmer, the impact on the reefs and all of those things, and those who are doing reef fishing, the tremendous impact that is having. And so the vulnerability is wide.
Which is why so much of the work is about, to reference what you talked about earlier, adaptation and mitigation, which are not the same things.
No.
Adaptation, you're talking about changes, making changes to handle the effects of climate change that are already happening. Mitigation is about reducing particular things from happening, preventing them from happening, preventative in that sense. With adaptation, let's talk about the work that we have been doing in terms of adaptation.
So we've been at this for some time in Jamaica. I think one of our climate scientists said that Jamaica is a climate sensitive country. And with that kind of knowledge, we have begun to put things in place to adapt. If you think of Vision 2030, for example, because of all of that, one of our national outcomes, outcome 14, I think, talks about adaptation to climate change and hazard risk reduction. And what does that mean? So it means, for example, I tell you that we are now putting tools in place to build our roads better. It talks about adjusting the size of the drains for runoff. It talks about introducing climate smart agriculture, and we've done quite a bit of work with the agriculture sector to get people to plant in a way that takes advantage of the conditions, but are not aggravated by the increases, the extremes that climate change might bring. Talk about bringing in new crops. We're talking about
building stronger homes.
We're talking about stronger homes, better ventilated homes, because that's an important issue, because we're talking about increasing temperatures and so on.
That's on the adaptation front.
Yes, we're still on adaptation, and with an important element of adaptation, certainly from an organization like mine, has to do with the kind of data that we are collecting. And so we've been working with the Met Services in building out the network of automatic weather stations so we can know what the weather is like, and to be able to have apps and so on for farmers to tap into that information. The same thing is being done for fishers as well. So those are some adaptive measures.
And with the mitigation now, efforts to reduce the factors that cause climate change. When you mitigation, what are some of the, mainly by lowering greenhouse gas emissions, what are some examples of the work we've been doing in mitigation? So
the government of Jamaica has been, well, I should tell you about the policy. So we've put the policy frame in place. You would have heard, for example, that we have upped our use of renewable energy and increasing investment in that area as well. I think we're about 18% of I think it's 18, right? There was a projection that we will have around 30% of renewables in our energy mix.
So it's like solar, like wind?
Solar, wind, geothermal, nuclear, all of those make up renewable energy. And I think we're about 18% of renewables in our energy mix right now. And the government of Jamaica has put in a long-term low carbon emission strategy and planned a number of major projects up to 2050. And those are some of the mitigation strategies that we're taking. The public sector agencies are also being very strongly encouraged to introduce renewables in their offices and all of that.
No, as we close, I want to talk a little bit about, I want to close where we started by saying that this isn't just about the government. We talked about a range of problems that are not just problems for individuals, they're problems for communities and workplaces, private sector, public sector, NGO, etc. So let's hone in on what individual partners can do. First, people who work in the public sector. Listening to this conversation, what should I, as a civil servant working in government, how can I contribute to the effort?
Well, I think first of all, you need to understand that climate change is real and that we have to be doing something to address it. So we have it in our policies. we have to ensure that when we do our annual budgets, we are incorporating adaptation measures in our programs. When we are proposing projects, we have to ensure that the impact is going to be climate neutral, in the sense that it will cause no negative impact to the environment by increasing greenhouse gas emission. We also have to ensure that what we're doing is not something that is maladaptive, but something that will strengthen the country's resilience.
So look, for instance, at putting in solar as much as possible rather than air conditioning necessarily.
No, well, you need air conditioning because it's hot. So
yes.
The point is using solar to drive, to fuel the air conditioning.
Okay.
But I think we have to start from information. We have to inform ourselves and be able to inform people, and to help people to understand that government, as you said, can't do everything by itself. I know we're wrapping, but I think it might have been in 2012 we did a knowledge, attitude and practice survey to climate change, and we found at that time that roughly 66% of the population,
that's 2 out of 3.
2 out of 3 knew about climate change and believe that it had an impact on them, or that they could do anything about it. So we did a major public education drive in 2022 when we did another knowledge, attitude and practice survey. We found that people had begun to take this much more seriously, and the survey was done by the University of the West Indies and Statin for us. And at this point, we had reached the point where 87% of the population accepted that they knew something about it, that they cared about it, and that they had to do something about it.
On that point then, when you talk about what ordinary Jamaicans or even people in community groups can do, what kind of work can they do apart from, you know, finding out about the problem?
Right, so we need them to stop burning, you know, that's a very basic thing. We need people at the community level to do something to help themselves by way of, say, the agriculture, and to do it in a way, as I said before, they are not damaging the environment. We need people at the community level to take advantage of the range of financing opportunities that are made available, and there have been a number of projects with financing for adaptation at the community level. We need people to stop going up in the forest and chopping out the trees, because if they do that, they're not going to have good, clean water or even available water. We need people to be able to put in a little tree here or there so that we can help.
To plant your backyard gardens, your community gardens.
The backyard garden, the community gardens, to keep the place clean and all of that. So those are important personal measures. Do not block the drains, because don't throw your old fridge in the drain, because the point is, when we have the extreme rainfall, there's likely to be flooding, and you could be at the wrong end of all of that.
And finally, our international development partners, because as they say, it takes cash to care.
Okay, so yes, it takes cash to care, and the truth of the matter is that a small island developing state like Jamaica produces a minuscule contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. We are, however, doing our part. In our Vision 2030, we accepted that we want to contribute to the global attempt to reduce GHGs, but we need our partners to continue to work with us in this regard. We have, in the Planning Institute of Jamaica, recently developed a strategy for climate finance, and we are reaching out to our partners to help us to continue to fund our interventions.
So whether you're talking about your partners, people who work public administration, for instance, civil servants or members of civil society community groups, or ordinary Jamaicans, information, you say, is key, so they can come to the PIOJ's webpage?
Yes. We are also cross-posting information. One of the things that I failed to say is that we work with the University of the West Indies to do the State of the Jamaican Climate Reports, and that has projections on the various climate parameters: rainfall, wind, temperature, etc., up to the end of this century. And you will see in that report, and we have it in a ordinary man's language, yes, as well as technical report and policymakers guide. So we make all this information available. We are cross-posting on various sites, and we're committing to doing public education campaigns to help to increase knowledge about the issue. And it's everybody's business, and we're asking everyone to make a contribution. And today is another part of that effort. So I'd like to thank you very much, Claire Bernard, Deputy Director General at the Planning Institute of Jamaica. That's it for this episode of Let's Talk Goals. I'm Archibald Gordon. See you next time.